winter of 1871 had been particularly harsh in New Mexico territory, and the snow lay thick on the platform of the Santa Fe Railroad station. Steam hissed from the locomotive that had just arrived, carrying its precious cargo of mail-order brides from the east. The crowd of prospective husbands pressed forward, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air, each man hoping to catch a glimpse of his future wife. Among them stood a figure who drew stares and whispers. He was a full head taller than any other man present, with shoulders broad enough to fill a doorway. His Apache heritage was evident in his strong features and long black hair tied back with a leather cord. Unlike the other men who jostled for position, he remained perfectly still at the edge of the platform, his dark eyes watching the proceedings with quiet dignity. "Lord have mercy," muttered Harvey Brennan, the local blacksmith, to his companion. "What's that giant doing here? Surely he don't expect any decent woman to—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "That's the Apache fellow works out at the Morrison Ranch," replied Thomas Whitley, the general store owner. "Name's Joseph Crow, though most just call him Big Joe when they're feeling charitable." His tone suggested that charitable feelings were rare. The women began to descend from the train, their Eastern dresses looking out of place against the rough wooden platform and adobe buildings. Each clutched a small valise and wore an expression somewhere between hope and terror. The matchmaker, Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, a stern woman in her 50s, began calling out names and pairing the women with their intended husbands. Miss Catherine Mills. A petite blonde stepped forward, quickly claimed by a smiling rancher. Miss Dorothy Patterson. Another match made, another couple walking away together. As the pairings continued, the crowd's attention kept drifting to Joseph Crow. Some of the men snickered openly. "Bet he figured he'd just reach up and pluck one off the train like picking apples," someone joked, earning scattered laughter. "More like picking from the top shelf that nobody else can reach," another added. Joseph's expression never changed, but his hands, clasped behind his back, tightened slightly. The women, too, had noticed him. As each descended from the train, their eyes would inevitably find the towering figure, and just as inevitably, they would quickly look away. Some clutched their shawls tighter. Others moved to put other men between themselves and the Apache giant. Miss Rebecca Foster. A pretty brunette practically ran to her intended, shooting one last fearful glance at Joseph as she passed. Mrs. Hartwell's lips pursed tighter with each pairing. She had been in the matchmaking business for 15 years, and she knew trouble when she saw it. She'd tried to discourage Joseph Crow when he'd first written to her agency, suggesting perhaps he might have better luck elsewhere, but he'd paid the fee like any other man, and the law was the law, even if the law didn't account for the prejudices of the heart. "Ain't right, him being here," grumbled Walter Mason, a local farmer. "These ladies come out here expecting Christian husbands, not—" He gestured vaguely at Joseph. "He's baptized, same as you," said Father Miguel from the local mission, who had appeared at the edge of the crowd. "I performed the ceremony myself." "Don't make him civilized," Walter shot back. "You can't wash away what he is with a little holy water." The priest's face darkened, but before he could respond, another name was called. Miss Helen Crawford. The remaining women were fewer now, and Joseph still stood alone. The crowd's amusement had turned to something uglier. Men began to make wagers on whether any woman would be desperate enough to accept him. $5 says they'll all get back on that train before they'd go with him, declared Samuel Henderson, slapping the money on a nearby barrel. "You're on," said another man. "There's always one who's desperate enough." Joseph heard every word. He'd learned long ago that people assumed those who were quiet were also deaf. His mother had taught him that dignity was not in answering every insult, but in standing tall despite them. Still, the words stung, each one a small cut added to thousands of others accumulated over his 35 years. As more names were called and more women paired off, the atmosphere grew tense. There were only a handful of women left now, and several unclaimed men besides Joseph. But the focus remained on him, the crowd waiting to see him humiliated. "Miss Alice Turner." A mousy woman in spectacles stepped forward, took one look at Joseph, and practically threw herself at a shopkeeper from Albuquerque. The laughter was less subtle now. "Maybe if he got on his knees, he'd be the right height," someone called out. "Still be too wide. Poor woman would need a ladder just to kiss him good night." Joseph's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He had known this would be difficult. When he'd seen the advertisement for mail-order brides, he'd hesitated for months before writing to the agency. But the loneliness of his small cabin in the mountains, the silence that pressed in during the long winters, had finally driven him to try. He was a good man. He knew that about himself. Even if others couldn't see past his size and his heritage, he had steady work, had saved enough money to provide for a family. His cabin was sturdy and warm. Built with his own hands, he could read and write, thanks to Father Miguel. He didn't drink or gamble. But none of that seemed to matter when people looked at him and saw only a savage giant. "Miss Virginia Lewis." Another woman. Another quick pairing with someone else. The crowd was enjoying itself now, the entertainment value of Joseph's humiliation worth standing in the cold. "Mrs." Hartwell looked increasingly uncomfortable. She glanced at Joseph, then at her dwindling list of names. There were only 3 women left. And 5 men, including Joseph. This was going to end badly. She could feel it. "Perhaps," she said, raising her voice to address Joseph directly for the first time. "Mr. Crow might prefer to... That is, if you'd like to withdraw your application, the agency would be happy to refund." "No, ma'am," Joseph said, his deep voice cutting through the chatter. It was the first time he'd spoken, and the sound of it, low and rumbling like distant thunder, made several people step back. "I paid my fee. I'll wait." The crowd fell silent for a moment. Then the whispers started again, uglier than before. "You hear that? He thinks he's got rights same as white folks. Someone ought to explain to him that money can't buy what ain't for sale. These ladies didn't come all this way to marry no Indian, giant or otherwise." Father Miguel stepped forward. "Gentlemen, please, this is meant to be a joyous occasion." "Stay out of it, Padre," warned Jake Morrison, who employed Joseph at his ranch. Even he seemed embarrassed by his workers' presence here. "Joe's a good hand, but he ought to know his place." Joseph's place, it seemed, was standing alone in the snow while others found happiness. He'd known his place all his life. Too Indian for the whites. Too white for the Apache who'd cast out his mother for lying with a cavalry soldier. Too big to be ignored. Too different to be accepted. The final pairings were being made now. "Mrs." Hartwell's voice had lost its authoritative ring, becoming almost apologetic as she called the last names. The crowd pressed closer, sensing the climax of their entertainment. Joseph stood as he had throughout, straight and tall, his face betraying nothing of the humiliation burning in his chest. He thought of his mother, dead these 10 years, who'd told him he deserved love like any other man. He thought of the letter he'd written to the agency, laboring over each word, trying to present himself as worthy. He thought of the hope he'd carefully tended these past months, now withering in the cold like everything else. "Well," said someone in the crowd as it became clear Joseph would be left standing alone, "I guess that settles that. Even mail-order brides got standards." The laughter that followed was harsh and mean-spirited. Men collected their wagered money. Women tisked and shook their heads. And Joseph Crow stood alone in the swirling snow, a giant among men but somehow diminished, his hopes scattered like the ice crystals in the wind. But he did not move. He did not bow his head or shuffle away in defeat. He stood there, waiting. Though for what, even he couldn't say. Perhaps for dignity, perhaps for a miracle, or perhaps simply because leaving would mean admitting that they were right, that he was too big, too different, too Apache to be loved. The crowd began to disperse. Their entertainment concluded, But Joseph remained, a solitary figure on the platform, waiting in the snow for something that seemed would never come. The platform had nearly emptied when she stepped off the train. She was the last one, having waited in her seat until the commotion died down, watching through the frost-covered window as woman after woman was claimed. She'd seen the tall man standing alone, seen how the others avoided him, heard the cruel laughter carrying through the thin walls of the passenger car. Margaret Cole was 28 years old, which made her ancient by mail-order bride standards. She wasn't pretty. Her face was too angular, her nose too prominent, her hair a dull brown that refused to hold a curl. She'd worked as a seamstress in Baltimore until her eyesight began to fail from years of straining over fine stitches by candlelight. When the shop let her go, she'd had two choices, the poorhouse or this. She clutched her worn carpet bag and stepped onto the platform. Mrs. Hartwell looked up from her ledger with surprise and something like dismay. "Oh, that is Miss Cole?" "Yes, ma'am." "Mrs." Hartwell fumbled with her papers. "I'm afraid there's been some confusion. All the gentlemen have been paired." "Not all," Margaret said quietly, looking directly at Joseph Crow. The few remaining people on the platform turned to stare. Joseph himself seemed frozen, uncertain he'd understood correctly. "Mrs." Hartwell's voice dropped to an urgent whisper. "My dear, you don't understand. That man he's available?" Margaret suggested. "He's an Indian, Mrs." Hartwell hissed. "And look at the size of him. Surely you can't be serious." Margaret walked past the matchmaker, her worn boots clicking on the wooden platform. The distance between her and Joseph seemed both endless and too short. She could hear whispers starting up again from the few lingerers who'd stayed to watch. "Is she blind? Must be desperate. Lord help her. She don't know what she's doing." Joseph watched her approach with an expression of wary disbelief. Up close, he was even taller than she'd appeared from the train window. She had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes, which were the deep brown of fertile earth after rain. Margaret stopped directly in front of him. Her heart was hammering, but her voice came out steady. "Mr. Crow?" He nodded slowly, as if afraid sudden movement might scare her away. "I'm Margaret Cole." She extended her hand. He stared at it for a moment before carefully engulfing it in his own. His hand was warm despite the cold, calloused from work, but gentle. "Miss Cole," he said, his deep voice barely above a whisper. "No, this won't do at all." Mrs. Hartwell had followed, flapping her papers. "Miss Cole, I must insist you reconsider. The agency has standards, and I cannot in good conscience—" "Did Mr. Crow pay his fee?" Margaret interrupted. "Well, yes, but did I pay mine? That's not the point." "Then I believe we've both met your standards." Margaret turned back to Joseph. "That is, if you'll have me, Mr. Crow." The platform had gone silent. Even the wind seemed to pause, holding its breath. Joseph's face showed a dozen emotions fighting for dominance: shock, hope, suspicion, wonder. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "I think you might want to reconsider. These folks aren't wrong about—" Margaret raised her chin and spoke clearly, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You're mine now." The words rang out across the platform like a bell. Someone gasped, "Mrs." Hartwell made a sound like a stepped-on cat, and Joseph Crow's eyes widened as if he'd been struck by lightning. "What did she say?" someone whispered. "She can't mean it." "Has she lost her mind?" Margaret kept her eyes on Joseph's face. "Unless you object." He shook his head slowly, still seeming stunned. "No, ma'am, no objection." "Then it's settled." She turned to Mrs. Hartwell. "I believe you need to record this in your ledger." The matchmaker looked like she'd swallowed something bitter. "Miss Cole, please, think of your reputation. Think of your future children." "I am," Margaret said firmly. "My future is with Mr. Crow, if he'll have me." "The whole town will talk. Mrs. Hartwell protested. "You'll be outcasts." "Then we'll be outcast together." Margaret looked back at Joseph. "Won't we?" For the first time since she'd approached him, something like a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Yes, ma'am, if that's what you want." "It's what I choose," she corrected. The remaining crowd was in an uproar now. Samuel Henderson, who'd won his bet that no woman would accept Joseph, looked furious at this turn of events. "This ain't right," he declared. "That woman must be touched in the head." "Or desperate," Walter Mason added. "What kind of woman chooses a savage when she could have—" "When she could have what?" Margaret turned to face them, her plain features animated with sudden fire. "One of you fine gentlemen who stood here making sport of a man for the crime of being different, who took bets on his humiliation. Yes, I heard you through the train window. Such admirable Christian behavior." The men had the grace to look slightly ashamed, but Samuel rallied. "You don't know what you're getting into. Woman, that ain't no ordinary man." "No," Margaret agreed. "He's not ordinary. An ordinary man would have left rather than endure your mockery. An ordinary man would have answered your insults with his fists, Mr. Crow showed more dignity in his silence than all of you combined showed with your wagering and cruel words. Father Miguel, who had remained at the edge of the gathering, smiled slightly. "Well said, Miss Cole." "This is a mistake, Mrs." Hartwell made one last attempt. "The agency cannot be held responsible." "No one's asking you to be responsible," Margaret said. "Just to do your job. Or shall I write to your supervisors in Chicago about how you tried to prevent a legal pairing because you disapproved of the gentleman's heritage?" The threat of involving her supervisors made Mrs. Hartwell blanch. With shaking hands, she made the notation in her ledger. "There, it's done. May God help you both." Joseph finally spoke again, his voice gentle despite its depth. "Miss Cole, you don't know me. You don't know anything about—" "I know enough," Margaret interrupted. "I know you paid your fee like any other man seeking a wife. I know you stood here with dignity while lesser men mocked you. I know you're strong enough to endure cruelty and gentle enough to worry about a stranger's welfare." She paused, then added more softly, "And I know what it's like to be unwanted." Something passed between them then, a recognition that went deeper than words. Joseph studied her face, not pretty by conventional standards, marked by years of hardship and disappointment, but lit now with a fierce determination that transformed it into something remarkable. "My cabin is a day's ride into the mountains," he said. "It's isolated. The winters are hard. I'm not afraid of hard work or solitude. People will talk. They'll be cruel. They're already talking and already cruel. At least we'll face it together." Joseph was quiet for a long moment. Then he bent down and picked up her carpetbag as easily as if it weighed nothing. "Then we should go. Miss Cole, the weather's turning worse." As they walked toward his wagon, the crowd parted before them like the Red Sea, faces showing shock, disgust, confusion, and, in a few cases, something like reluctant respect. Margaret kept her head high, her hand resting lightly on Joseph's arm. "Behind them, Mrs." Hartwell called out one last time. "Don't say I didn't warn you." Margaret didn't look back. "No need," she said, loud enough to carry. "I've been warned my whole life about what I can't have and shouldn't want. I think it's time I stopped listening." As Joseph helped her up into the wagon, his hands spanning her waist easily, she caught his eye and saw something there she recognized, the careful hope of someone who'd stopped believing in miracles, learning that perhaps they existed after all. The snow began to fall more heavily as they drove away from the station, leaving the shocked crowd behind. Margaret pulled her thin shawl tighter and felt Joseph shift beside her, blocking the worst of the wind with his body. "Thank you," he said quietly as the town fell away behind them. "For what?" "For seeing me." Margaret looked up at his profile. strong and solid against the white sky. "I think," she said, "we've both been invisible for too long." He glanced down at her, and this time the smile was real, transforming his stern features. "Not anymore." "No," she agreed, settling against his warmth as the wagon rolled toward the mountains and whatever future awaited them there. "Not anymore." The journey into the mountains took them through landscapes that grew wilder with each passing mile. The snow fell steadily, muffling the sounds of the wagon wheels and the steady clop of the draft horses' hooves. Margaret had never seen country like this, vast stretches of pine forest giving way to rocky outcroppings, frozen streams winding through valleys that seemed untouched by human hands. Joseph drove in silence, his large hands steady on the reins despite the worsening weather. Every so often, he would glance at her, as if still not quite believing she was there. Margaret understood the feeling. Just this morning, she'd been on a train full of hopeful women, all dreaming of new lives. Now she sat beside a man she'd known for less than an hour, heading into mountains that looked like the edge of the world. "Are you cold?" Joseph asked as the wind picked up, driving snow into their faces. "I'm fine," Margaret said, though her teeth were beginning to chatter. Without a word, Joseph reached behind the seat and pulled out a heavy buffalo robe, draping it over her shoulders. The warmth was immediate and welcome, as was the scent of cedar and smoke that clung to the fur. "Thank you," she said. He nodded, returning his attention to the increasingly difficult trail. The path had narrowed, winding upward through stands of aspen and pine. In places, the snow had drifted deep enough that Joseph had to climb down and lead the horses through, his strength making easy work of what would have stopped most men. As darkness began to fall, Margaret saw a structure emerge from the forest, a cabin built of logs, solid and well-crafted, with a stone chimney from which no smoke currently rose. It was larger than she'd expected, with glass windows and a covered porch that spoke of careful construction and pride in craftsmanship. "Home," Joseph said simply, pulling the wagon up to a small barn attached to the side. He helped her down, his hands lingering perhaps a moment longer than necessary on her waist. "See to the horses," he said. "Won't take but a moment. The door's not locked." Margaret made her way to the cabin, pushing open the heavy wooden door. The interior was dark and cold, but as her eyes adjusted, she could make out the careful organization of the space. Everything was neat, orderly, and spoke of a man who took care with his surroundings. She found matches and a lamp on a table near the door, lighting it to better see. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a large fireplace dominating one wall. A rocking chair sat near the hearth, and she could see Joseph had been working on something. Pieces of carved wood lay on a small table beside it. Through a doorway, she glimpsed what must be the bedroom. By the time Joseph entered, carrying her carpet bag and an armload of firewood, Margaret had explored enough to know that this was a home, not just a shelter. Books lined one wall, surprising for a man many would assume couldn't read. The kitchen was well stocked with preserves and dried goods. Everything spoke of permanence, of a life carefully built in solitude. Joseph set about building a fire with practiced efficiency. Soon, warmth began to creep into the room, pushing back the mountain cold. He lit more lamps, and in the warm glow, Margaret could see him more clearly. His face, which had seemed so stern at the station, was softer here in his own space. "You must be hungry," he said, moving to the kitchen area. "I've got stew I can warm, and bread from yesterday." "Let me help," Margaret offered, but he shook his head. "You're a guest tonight," he said firmly. "Tomorrow, if you're still here, we can figure out other arrangements." The way he said it, the careful hope mixed with expectation of disappointment, made Margaret's heart ache. "I'll still be here tomorrow," she said, "and the day after that." He paused in his preparations, not looking at her. "You might feel different come morning. It's one thing to make a stand in front of folks, Another to live with the choice. Margaret moved closer to the fire, warming her hands. Mr. Crow. Joseph, he corrected. Or Joe. Most call me Joe. Joseph, she repeated. May I ask you something? He nodded, returning to preparing their meal. Why did you send for a bride? His hands stilled for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was quiet. Gets lonely up here. I've lived alone since my mother died 10 years back. Built this place myself, made a good life. But comes a time when a man wants more than just surviving. Wants someone to share the sunrise with. Someone to talk to besides the horses. He gave a self-deprecating smile. Foolish, maybe. Not foolish, Margaret said softly. Brave. He looked at her then, really looked at her. Most would say foolish, expecting a woman to choose this life. Choose me. Then most would be wrong. Margaret moved to the table as he set down bowls of steaming stew. May I ask another question? You can ask anything you like. The things they said at the station, does that happen often? Joseph's face hardened slightly. Often enough. My mother was Apache. My father was a cavalry soldier who didn't stay around to see me born. I don't fit anywhere neat and tidy. Too Apache for the whites. Too white for the Apache. He shrugged. Learned young that most folks need someone to look down on. Being big just makes me an easier target. They ate in companionable silence for a while. The stew was good. Hearty and filling. The bread, while a day old, was well made. Margaret found herself relaxing for the first time since leaving Baltimore. Your turn, Joseph said eventually. Why did you choose me? Margaret considered her answer. I've been rejected by 3 different men who answered my letters, she said finally. Too plain, too old, too outspoken. One traveled all the way to Baltimore to meet me, took one look, and got back on the train. She met his eyes. I know what it's like to stand there while people judge you and find you wanting. When I saw you on that platform, saw how they treated you, I recognized something. So you chose me out of pity? No. Her voice was firm. I chose you because when everyone was being cruel, you stood with dignity. Because when Mrs. Hartwell offered you an out, you stayed. Because you could have used your size to intimidate, but you didn't. You're a good man. Joseph Crow. I could see that from the train window. He was quiet for a long moment. Then, I should show you the bedroom. You'll want to get settled. He led her to the smaller room, where a well-made bed with a colorful quilt dominated the space. This is yours, he said. I'll take the floor by the fire. Joseph! No, this is your bed. It's yours now, he said firmly. I've slept on harder ground than a cabin floor. Won't hear any argument about it. He fetched extra blankets from a chest, gathering them up along with a pillow. Privy's out back, he said. I'll walk you out when you need. Not safe to go alone in the dark. Mountain cats sometimes come close in winter. As he turned to leave, Margaret caught his arm, even through his shirt. She could feel the solid strength of him. Joseph, thank you for everything. He looked down at where her hand rested on his arm, then at her face. You might not be thanking me come morning. He said, this life, it's not easy. Town's a day's ride. In winter, sometimes we get snowed in for weeks, and the people will say terrible things. Margaret finished. They did that in Baltimore, too. At least here, I'll have good reason to avoid them. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. You're a strange woman. Margaret Cole. Probably, she agreed. But I'm your strange woman now. The words hung in the air between them, echoing her declaration at the station. Joseph's expression softened into something wondering and vulnerable. Get some rest, he said gently. Morning comes early in the mountains. After he left, Margaret unpacked her few belongings. Her hands shook slightly as she hung her spare dress on a peg, placed her Bible on the small bedside table, and tucked her mother's photograph beneath her pillow. The reality of what she'd done was beginning to settle in. She'd tied herself to a man she didn't know, in a place she'd never been, far from anything familiar. By tomorrow, word would have spread through the town about the plain spinster who'd chosen the Apache giant. There would be no going back. But as she lay in the bed that smelled of cedar and pine soap, listening to Joseph moving quietly in the main room, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Not the desperate hope of her letters to potential husbands, but something quieter and stronger. Through the doorway, she could see him sitting by the fire, working on his carving. His large hands moved with surprising delicacy, coaxing shapes from the wood. He'd loosened his hair from its tie, and it fell like a black curtain past his shoulders. In the firelight, he looked both powerful and gentle, a contradiction that somehow made perfect sense. Margaret closed her eyes, pulling the quilt up to her chin. Tomorrow would bring challenges. There would be hard times ahead. She had no illusions about that. But tonight, she was warm and safe in a well-built cabin, with a good man keeping watch in the next room. "Still here," she whispered into the darkness, a promise to herself and to him. "Still here." In the main room, Joseph heard the whisper and paused in his carving. He looked toward the bedroom doorway, then back at the piece of wood in his hands. It was beginning to take the shape of a bird, a small, plain sparrow. But in his hands, even a sparrow could be made beautiful. He smiled to himself and continued carving, the storm howling outside making the warmth within seem all the more precious. 2 weeks had passed since Margaret's arrival, and a routine had developed between them. Joseph would rise before dawn to tend the animals and check his trap lines, while Margaret kept the house and prepared meals. They moved around each other with careful courtesy, still learning the rhythms of shared space after years of solitude. The need for supplies finally drove them down the mountain. Joseph had put off the trip as long as possible, but flour was running low, and Margaret needed fabric for clothing better suited to mountain life than her thin Eastern dresses. "We don't have to go," Joseph said that morning, watching her pin up her hair. "I can make the trip alone." "No," Margaret said firmly. "I won't hide. Besides, I need to select the fabric myself." The journey to town took most of the morning. As they descended from the mountains, the snow gave way to muddy streets and the sounds of civilization. Margaret could feel Joseph tensing beside her as the first buildings came into view. "It won't be pleasant," he warned. "I know." She straightened her spine. "But necessary things rarely are." The general store sat on Main Street, its painted sign proclaiming Whitley's Dry Goods and Sundries. Several horses were tied at the hitching post, and Margaret could see figures moving inside through the windows. Joseph helped her down from the wagon, his jaw tight. "Stay close," he said quietly. The store fell silent when they entered. Thomas Whitley, behind the counter, froze mid-conversation with a customer. Every eye turned to them, and Margaret felt the weight of their stares like a physical thing. "Well," Whitley said finally, his voice artificially bright. "Joe, ma'am, what can I do for you?" Margaret stepped forward, pulling her list from her pocket. "We need supplies. Mr. Whitley, flour, sugar, salt." Of course. But Whitley's eyes kept darting between them, as if trying to solve a puzzle. As they moved through the store, whispers followed in their wake. Margaret pretended not to hear, focusing on selecting what they needed. She was examining bolts of fabric when she heard the bell above the door chime. Well, if it ain't the giant and his bride. She recognized the voice from the train station, Samuel Henderson, the man who'd taken bets on Joseph's humiliation. He swayed slightly, the smell of whiskey preceding him. Joseph moved closer to Margaret, not quite touching, but near enough that she could feel his presence like a wall between her and danger. "Henderson," Joseph said quietly, "we're just here for supplies." "Course you are." Henderson's laugh was ugly. "Though I can't imagine what supplies would help with Your situation. His bloodshot eyes fixed on Margaret. Still time to come to your senses, woman. We all make mistakes. The only mistake, Margaret said clearly, would be listening to the opinions of a drunk who gambles on other people's misfortune. Henderson's face flushed red. You got a tongue on you. That why no decent man would have you? Had to settle for... Joseph's hand clenched, but Margaret touched his arm lightly. Mr. Whitley, she said, turning away from Henderson. I'll take 6 yards of the blue wool, please, and 3 of the brown cotton. Whitley hurried to cut the fabric, clearly eager to complete the transaction before trouble started. But Henderson wasn't finished. You know what they say about Apache bucks and white women. He slurred, moving closer. Betty... The sound of Joseph's fist hitting the counter was like a gunshot. The wood cracked. Everyone jumped. Enough, Joseph said. His voice was still quiet, but there was something in it that made Henderson step back. You threatening me, Indian? No. Joseph's control was visible. Every muscle held in check. But you'll speak respectfully to my wife, or we'll have a problem. Your wife. Henderson spit the words like they tasted bad. That ain't legal, ain't natural. It's perfectly legal, said a new voice from the doorway. Father Miguel entered, his cassock dusty from riding. I checked the territorial laws myself. Would you like to see the statutes, Mr. Henderson? Henderson muttered something obscene and shouldered past the priest, slamming the door behind him. An uncomfortable silence settled over the store. Margaret calmly continued selecting items, though her hands trembled slightly. Joseph remained close, a solid presence at her shoulder. That'll be $8.40, Whitley said when everything was tallied. Joseph paid without comment, gathering their purchases. As they turned to leave, another customer, a woman Margaret recognized from the train station, blocked their path. How can you stand it? The woman asked Margaret, her voice pitched low but urgent. Living with that? Aren't you afraid? Margaret looked up at Joseph, who had gone very still. Then she looked back at the woman. Afraid? Of my husband? She allowed a small smile. Ma'am, I've never felt safer in my life. But he's 6 feet 5 inches of decent man, Margaret finished, which is more than I can say for some others of more acceptable height. She took Joseph's arm. Shall we go, husband? They loaded the wagon in silence. It wasn't until they were clear of town that Joseph spoke. You didn't have to defend me. Someone needed to. It'll make things harder for you. The women especially. They could have been your friends. Those women? Margaret shook her head. I've known their type all my life. They smile to your face while cataloging your flaws for later discussion. I prefer honest hostility to false friendship. Joseph was quiet for a moment. Henderson was drunk, but he'll remember. He's not the forgiving type. Neither am I, Margaret said. And I have a better memory than most drunks. Despite the tension, Joseph's mouth quirked slightly. You really told him off. He deserved worse. Most people think he's right. About us. About it not being natural. Margaret turned to face him fully. Joseph, what's natural? Is it natural to ship women across the country like cattle to marry strangers? Is it natural to judge a man's worth by his blood rather than his deeds? If that's natural, I want no part of it. They rode in silence for a while, the mountains rising before them like a sanctuary. Thank you, Joseph said finally. For what? For seeing me as a man, not just an Apache, not just a giant, just a man. You're welcome, Margaret said softly. Though you're wrong about one thing. He glanced at her, eyebrows raised. You're not just a man, she said. You're my man, and I protect what's mine. The words hung between them, an echo of her declaration at the train station, but deeper now, more certain. Joseph's hands tightened on the reins, and something passed over his face. Surprise, warmth, and perhaps the beginning of something more. "Careful, Mrs. Crow," he said, and his use of her married name sent an unexpected shiver through her. "People might think you're growing fond of me." "People already think worse," she replied. "Let them think what they will." As they climbed back into the mountains, leaving the ugliness of town behind, Margaret felt the truth of her own words settling into her bones. She was growing fond of him, this gentle giant who carved delicate birds from wood, who read books by lamplight, who treated her with unfailing courtesy despite the world's cruelty. It wasn't the grand romance the other mail-order brides had probably dreamed of, but it was real and solid, and growing stronger each day, like the cabin Joseph had built with his own hands. "Next time," Joseph said as their home came into view, "I'll go alone." "Next time," Margaret countered. "We'll go together, just like this time." He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "Together, then," as they unloaded the supplies, working side by side in comfortable rhythm. Margaret thought about the woman in the store who'd asked if she was afraid. The truth was, she had been afraid of ending up alone, afraid of being unwanted, afraid of settling for less than she deserved. But standing beside Joseph Crow, facing down the prejudice of an entire town, she realized those fears had somewhere along the way transformed into something else: determination. She was determined to make this marriage work, determined to prove the naysayers wrong, determined to build a life with this man who deserved so much more than the world seemed willing to give him. "Margaret," Joseph called from the barn. "Come see." She found him kneeling beside a small wooden box. Inside, nestled in straw, were 3 eggs. "The hen's finally settled enough to lay," he said, grinning. "Fresh eggs for breakfast tomorrow." It was such a simple thing, but Margaret found herself smiling back. "Our first eggs," she said. "Our first eggs," he agreed, and the word "our" had never sounded so full of promise. The winter deepened, and with it came the kind of snow that turned the mountain into an island of white. For 3 weeks, they'd been cut off from the world below, the paths impassable, the silence complete except for the wind and the crackling of the fire. It was during these long, quiet days that Margaret and Joseph learned each other in ways that went beyond words. She discovered he woke every night at precisely 2 o'clock, a habit from years of checking trap lines, and would stand at the window, watching the snow fall. He learned that she hummed while she worked, old hymns from her childhood that seemed to make the cabin warmer. On this particular evening, Margaret was mending one of Joseph's shirts while he worked on a new carving. The domesticity of the scene struck her. How natural it had become, this shared life. "My mother used to say that people are like the seasons," Joseph said suddenly, his knife moving steadily over the wood. "Some are spring, all promise and pretty flowers. Some are summer, bright and easy to love." "And winter?" Margaret asked, though she thought she knew. "Winter people are the ones who endure," he said. "Not much to look at, maybe, but they last." "Is that what we are, winter people?" He looked up at her then, firelight playing across his features. "I think so. We've both survived our share of storms." Before Margaret could respond, his head snapped up, alert. She'd learned to read his body language. This meant something was wrong. "What is it?" "Horses," he said quietly. "Several of them." Margaret's blood chilled. No one traveled in weather like this unless driven by desperate purpose. Joseph rose, reaching for the rifle above the mantel. "Stay inside," he commanded, but Margaret was already reaching for the shotgun he'd taught her to use. "Together," she said firmly. The pounding on the door came moments later, violent and demanding. "Open up, Indian! We know you're in there!" Henderson's voice, but he wasn't alone. Margaret could hear other voices, other horses stamping in the snow. "What do you want?" Joseph called through the door. "Justice!" Another voice. She recognized it as Walter Mason. "You threatened a white man in town. Time to answer for it." "I threatened no one." Joseph said calmly. "Go home, Henderson. You're drunk again." "Don't matter if I'm drunk," Henderson shouted. "You put hands on me." "I hit a counter." Joseph corrected. "Never touched you." "Same thing. Threatening behavior from a savage." The door shuddered under a violent kick. Margaret heard the wood crack. "That's enough," she called out. "I'll have you know I've written to the territorial marshal about the harassment we've endured. You break down this door, and you'll answer to federal law." Silence for a moment. Then harsh laughter. "You think anyone cares what happens to an Indian and his squaw?" The word wasn't even fully out before Joseph wrenched open the door, rifle in hand. The sight of him, massive in the doorframe with death in his eyes, made the men stumble backward. "You will not use that word," he said, voice deadly quiet. "Not about my wife. Not ever." Margaret counted 5 men, all armed, all showing the effects of alcohol and mob courage. Henderson stood at the front, weaving slightly but his hand near his pistol. "Or what?" Henderson sneered. "You'll shoot us all? Add murder to your crimes?" "No shooting necessary," Margaret said, stepping beside Joseph. The shotgun in her hands was steady. "Though I should mention I'm an excellent shot. My father taught me to hunt birds on the wing. Men move considerably slower than quail." One of the men, she thought his name was Davis, shifted nervously. "Sam, maybe we should—" "Shut up," Henderson snarled. "We came here to teach this Indian his place." "His place," Margaret interrupted, "is in his own home, which you're threatening to invade. That's a hanging offense in the territory. Mr. Henderson, are you certain you want to proceed?" "You're bluffing." "Am I?" Margaret's voice was ice. "Joseph, show them the letter from Marshal Garrett." It was a gamble. There was no letter, but Joseph, bless him, played along without hesitation. Inside, on the table, he said, "Dated last week." The men exchanged uncertain glances. The federal marshals were not to be trifled with, and everyone knew it. "You're lying," Henderson said, but doubt had crept into his voice. "Test me," Margaret suggested. "Break down our door, assault us in our home. See how the federal government feels about citizens taking the law into their own hands." She paused. "Of course, that's assuming you all survive. As I mentioned, I'm quite good with this shotgun." The standoff stretched taut. Snow swirled between the two groups, and Margaret could feel the violence hovering like a living thing. One wrong word, one sudden movement, and blood would flow. Then, from down the mountain, came the sound of more horses. Many horses, moving fast despite the snow. "What the hell?" one of Henderson's men muttered. The riders came into view, 6 men, all armed, led by a figure Margaret recognized with relief, Sheriff Coleman from the county seat. Beside him rode Father Miguel. "Evening, gentlemen," the sheriff said mildly, though his hand rested on his pistol. "Bit cold for a social call, isn't it?" "Sheriff," Henderson started, "this Indian is in his own home," Coleman finished. "While you appear to be forming an illegal mob, Father Miguel here was quite concerned when he saw you boys riding out. Thought I'd better come see what was happening." "He threatened me," Henderson protested. "Did he now?" The sheriff looked at Joseph. "That true, Joe?" "I hit a counter. Joseph said, after he insulted my wife, never touched him." Coleman looked back at Henderson. "Doesn't sound like much of a threat to me. Certainly not worth riding through a blizzard for." His voice hardened. "Mount up, boys. Party's over." "You're taking his side?" Henderson was incredulous. "An Indian's word over white men." "I'm taking the law's side," Coleman said. "And the law says a man's home is his castle, even an Apache's. Now get moving before I arrest the lot of you for attempted breaking and entering." There was grumbling. Threats muttered under breath. But the presence of the sheriff and his men tipped the balance, one by one. Henderson's group mounted their horses. "This isn't over," Henderson promised, glaring at Joseph and Margaret. "It better be." Sheriff Coleman said, "I catch wind of any more harassment, and you'll be explaining yourself to a judge. That goes for all of you." As the group rode away, Father Miguel dismounted and approached the cabin. "Are you both all right?" "Fine, Father," Margaret said, finally lowering the shotgun. Her hands were shaking now. "Thank you for fetching the sheriff." "I've been watching Henderson since the incident in town," the priest said. "When I saw him gathering men and riding out in this weather, I knew it meant trouble." Sheriff Coleman joined them. "Joe, Mrs. Crow, I apologize for this. Henderson's been a problem for years, but this is escalating. I'll have words with him when he sobers up." "Words won't change what he is," Joseph said quietly. "No," the sheriff agreed. "But consequences might—" "I meant what I said. Any more trouble, and I'll arrest him." He looked at Margaret. That was quick thinking. Ma'am mentioning the federal marshals probably prevented bloodshed. "Just protecting my home," Margaret said simply, after the sheriff and Father Miguel left, promising to check on them after the storm. Joseph and Margaret stood in their doorway, watching the snow erase the tracks of their unwanted visitors. "You would have shot them," Joseph said. It wasn't a question. "To protect you, yes." He was quiet for a long moment. "No one's ever—" He stopped. Started again. "I've always fought my own battles." "Not anymore," Margaret said. "We're partners now. Your battles are mine." He looked down at her, something shifting in his dark eyes. "Margaret." She waited, but he seemed unable to find the words. Instead, he reached out, his large hand cupping her face with infinite gentleness. His thumb brushed across her cheekbone, and she leaned into the touch. "You're the bravest woman I've ever known," he said finally. "I'm not brave," she said. "I'm just too stubborn to let them win." A smile tugged at his mouth. "Stubborn, then my stubborn wife who faces down mobs with a shotgun." "Your stubborn wife who won't let anyone hurt what's hers," she corrected. They stood there in the doorway, snow swirling around them, the cabin warm at their backs. The danger had passed for now, but they both knew it would return. Henderson and his ilk wouldn't give up easily. But at this moment, with Joseph's hand warm against her face and the steadiness of shared purpose between them, Margaret felt no fear. They were winter people, built to endure. Whatever storms came, they would weather them. Together. "Come inside," Joseph said softly. "You're getting cold." As he closed and barred the door behind them, Margaret realized something had changed. The careful distance they'd maintained, the polite boundaries of strangers learning to live together, those walls had crumbled in the face of external threat. "Joseph," she said as he rebuilt the fire, "what you said about people being like seasons." He looked up at her. "I think some people are all seasons," she continued. "The promise of spring, the warmth of summer, the harvest of fall, and yes, the endurance of winter. Maybe that's what we could be together." He rose slowly, crossing to where she stood. "You think so?" "I know so," she said, and meant it. This time, when he reached for her, she met him halfway. The attack came at dawn, 3 days after the sheriff's visit. Margaret woke to the sound of breaking glass and Joseph's shout of warning. She rolled from the bed just as flames erupted against the bedroom window. Someone had thrown a torch. "Margaret!" Joseph burst through the doorway, already dressed. "They're here! Get your clothes! Quickly!" She threw on her dress and boots, grabbing the shotgun from beside the bed. Through the broken window, she could see figures moving in the pre-dawn darkness. Many figures. "How many?" she asked, checking her ammunition. 8, maybe 10. Joseph's face was grim. "They're surrounding us," Another window shattered in the main room. More torches flew through. But Joseph had anticipated this. Buckets of water stood ready, and he doused the flames before they could catch. "Come out, Indian!" Henderson's voice, rougher now with real malice. "Face justice like a man." "The only justice here is what you're bringing on yourself," Margaret called back. "The sheriff warned you." "The sheriff ain't here," another voice shouted. "And accidents happen in the mountains. Cabin fires, especially. Real tragic when folks get trapped inside." Joseph pulled Margaret back from the window as a shot rang out, splintering the frame where she'd been standing. "They mean to kill us," she said, the reality of it settling like lead in her stomach. "Yes," Joseph's voice was steady, "but they'll find it harder than they think." He'd prepared for this possibility. She realized. The windows had thick shutters that he now barred closed. The walls were solid logs that would resist fire better than Henderson's group probably expected. And Joseph himself, she'd seen him gentle, patient, careful. But now she saw the warrior his mother's people had raised. "The root cellar," he said. "If things go bad, we stay together." Margaret interrupted. "Win or lose, we stay together." He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. Together. The assault began in earnest. Torches rained against the cabin, but the snow on the roof and Joseph's preparations kept the fire from catching. Shots peppered the walls, seeking gaps in their defenses. Margaret took position at one window, Joseph at another. They returned fire sparingly, making each shot count. Margaret winged one attacker who got too close, sending him scrambling back with curses. "That's my wife!" Henderson screamed. "She shot Davy!" "Should have stayed home, Davy!" Margaret shouted back, reloading. Time stretched strangely in siege. Minutes felt like hours. The sun climbed higher, revealing their attackers clearly. Henderson's group had grown, including some faces Margaret didn't recognize. They'd brought more than torches this time. "Joseph," she said, watching two men unload something from a pack horse. "Is that?" "Blasting powder," he confirmed grimly. "They mean to blow the door." "Can we stop them?" "We can try." What followed was a desperate dance of gunfire and movement. Joseph's rifle cracked again and again, driving back anyone who tried to approach with the explosives. Margaret covered him when he reloaded, her shotgun keeping the others at bay. But they were two against many, and their ammunition wasn't infinite. "Running low," Joseph said after driving back another attempt. Margaret checked her own supplies. "Same." They shared a look of understanding. When the ammunition ran out, the fight would turn one-sided quickly. "Margaret," Joseph said quietly, still watching the windows, "I want you to know." "Save it," she said fiercely. "Tell me after we survive this." Despite everything, he smiled. "Stubborn woman." "You're stubborn woman," she corrected, making him laugh even as another volley of shots struck the cabin. Then, just as their situation seemed most desperate, Margaret heard something that made her heart leap. A war cry echoing off the mountains. Not from Henderson's men, but from somewhere beyond them. "What?" Henderson's shout was cut off by the thunder of hooves. Through a crack in the shutters, Margaret saw them, Apache warriors, at least a dozen, sweeping down from the ridge like an avalanche. At their head rode a man who could have been Joseph's brother, tall and fierce, with the same strong features. Henderson's group scattered in panic. These weren't townsmen they were facing now, but warriors who'd been fighting since childhood. The would-be killers became the hunted, fleeing in all directions. The Apache riders pursued them briefly, ensuring they were truly routed, then circled back to the cabin, their leader dismounted, approaching the door. "Joseph Crow," he called in accented English. "It is Samuel Crow, your cousin. Open the door." Joseph hesitated, then unbarred the door. The man who entered was indeed his mirror image, though slightly older, dressed in a mix of traditional Apache clothing and white man's gear. "Samuel," Joseph said in Apache, which Margaret had been learning but couldn't fully follow. Then, in English. "Why are you here?" "Father Miguel," Samuel replied, also switching to English for Margaret's benefit. "He rode to the reservation yesterday, said you were in danger, said you had taken a wife who stood with you against the town." His dark eyes found Margaret. "This is her." "This is Margaret," Joseph confirmed. "Margaret, my cousin Samuel." Margaret nodded, still gripping her shotgun. "Thank you for coming." Samuel studied her with the same intense gaze Joseph often used. "You are the one who said you're mine now at the train station?" Heat rose in Margaret's cheeks. "News travels fast." Father Miguel told the story. My mother was impressed. She said any woman brave enough to claim Joseph in front of hostile witnesses was worth protecting. He turned to Joseph. "The family has been watching. We weren't sure you would be accepted back, after living so long in the white world. But for this woman, for this fight, we come." More Apache entered the cabin, reporting in their language. Samuel translated the key points. Henderson's group was thoroughly dispersed, though most had escaped. 2 were wounded, 1 seriously. They'd left behind their supplies and weapons in their panic. "They'll be back," Margaret said. "With more men, probably." "Maybe," Samuel agreed. "But word will spread that Joseph Crow is not alone, that attacking him means facing us." He smiled grimly. "White men are brave when the odds favor them, less so when they don't." The Apache warriors stayed through the day, helping repair the damage to the cabin and standing visible guard. It was a clear message to anyone watching. Joseph and Margaret were under protection. As evening fell, Samuel prepared to leave with his men. "You could come with us," he offered. "Both of you. The reservation isn't much, but you'd be safe." Joseph looked at Margaret. Leaving the decision to her, she thought about it. The safety of numbers, the escape from constant threat. But then she looked around the cabin they'd defended, the home they'd built together in more ways than one. "This is our place," she said. "We won't be driven from it." Samuel nodded, respecting the choice. "Then we go. But remember, you have family, both of you." He clasped Joseph's arm, then surprised Margaret by taking her hands. "Little sister," he said formally, "you honor us with your courage." After they left, Joseph and Margaret stood in their damaged but still standing home. Glass littered the floor. Bullet holes marked the walls, and the smell of smoke lingered. But they were alive, and they were together. "Your family came," Margaret said wonderingly, "even though you've been apart from them." "They came for you," Joseph corrected. Samuel was clear about that. "You impressed them." "By claiming you. By fighting for me. For us." He pulled her close, and she could feel the tremor in his large frame. Delayed reaction to how close they'd come to death. "Margaret, when I thought we might die—" "But we didn't," she interrupted, pressing her face against his chest. "We didn't, Joseph." They held each other as darkness fell, surrounded by the evidence of violence, but somehow feeling safer than before. The attack had been meant to destroy them. Instead, it had revealed strengths they hadn't known they possessed. Not just their own courage, but the unexpected support of others. "Henderson won't give up," Joseph said quietly. "No," Margaret agreed. "But neither will we." "It might get worse before it gets better." "Then we'll face worse together." Joseph pulled back to look at her face. "How did I get so lucky?" he asked. "To find a woman like you." "Not luck," Margaret said firmly. "Choice. I chose you. Remember?" "You're mine now," he quoted softly. And she heard in it all the wonder and gratitude and growing love that had developed between them. "Yours," she agreed. "And you're mine. Let them all come. We've proven today that together, we're stronger than they expected." Outside, snow began to fall again, covering the tracks of horses and the signs of battle. But inside the cabin, Warmth and light prevailed, and two winter people held each other close, knowing that whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it as one. The federal courthouse in Denver was an imposing building of red brick and granite, its corridors echoing with the footsteps of justice. Margaret adjusted her best dress, the blue wool she'd bought on that first trip to town, and tried to calm her nerves. Beside her, Joseph stood like a mountain, solid and reassuring in his dark suit. "The judge will see you now," the clerk announced. They entered the courtroom where Judge William Thornton presided, a man known for his fairness and intolerance of mob justice. The gallery was packed. Word of the trial had spread far. Margaret saw friendly faces. Father Miguel, Sheriff Coleman, even Thomas Whitley from the general store. But Henderson's supporters were there too, glowering from their side of the room. "This court is now in session," Judge Thornton announced. "We're here to address the charges against Samuel Henderson, Matthew Davis, Walter Mason, and associates for attempted murder, arson, and forming an illegal vigilante group." The prosecutor, a young man named Charles Everett, rose. "Your Honor, the evidence will show that these men conspired to murder Joseph and Margaret Crowe in their home, motivated by racial prejudice and personal vendetta." Henderson's lawyer, a slick man from Colorado Springs, objected immediately. "Your Honor, my clients were merely concerned citizens addressing a threat to their community. By forming a mob and attempting to burn people alive?" Judge Thornton's voice was dry. "Interesting interpretation of civic duty. Counselor, proceed. Mr. Everett." Margaret was called to testify first. She walked to the witness stand with her head high, aware of every eye upon her. "Mrs. Crowe," Everett began gently. "Please tell the court about the morning of February 15th. Margaret spoke clearly, describing waking to breaking glass and fire, the threats shouted by the attackers, the desperate defense of their home. She didn't embellish or dramatize. The facts were damning enough. "They said cabin fires were tragic," she testified. "That accidents happen in the mountains. They meant to kill us and make it look accidental." "And why would they want to harm you and your husband?" Margaret met Henderson's glare steadily. "Because I chose to marry an Apache man. Because we refused to be driven out by their harassment. Because Mr. Henderson couldn't accept being stood up to by people he considered beneath him." The defense attorney rose for cross-examination, his smile sharp. "Mrs. Crowe, isn't it true you threatened Mr. Henderson in Whitley's store?" "I told him he was a drunk who gambled on others' misfortune," Margaret replied. "If speaking truth is a threat, then yes, I threatened him." Scattered laughter from the gallery. Judge Thornton gavelled for order. "And this marriage of yours," the lawyer continued. "Some would say it's not natural. A white woman and an Apache." "Objection," Everett called. "Relevance?" Sustained. Judge Thornton ruled. "The legality of the Crowe's marriage is not in question here." Joseph testified next, his deep voice filling the courtroom as he described the siege, the preparation with blasting powder, the clear intent to kill. He was unshakable under cross-examination, his dignity intact despite the defense attorney's attempts to provoke him. "You're asking this court to take an Indian's word over white citizens?" the defense attorney pressed. "I'm asking this court to consider the truth." Joseph replied simply, "Truth doesn't change color based on who speaks it." Sheriff Coleman's testimony was crucial. "I warned Henderson and his group to stay away from the Crows. They chose to ignore that warning and attempt murder. If not for the Apache intervention, we'd be investigating 2 deaths, not a trial." The mention of the Apache rescue caused a stir. Samuel Crowe was present, having been subpoenaed, and his testimony was powerful. "My cousin married this woman in good faith," Samuel said, "when white men tried to murder them for it. We protected them. On the reservation. We call this justice. What do you call it here?" Father Miguel testified about fetching the sheriff when he saw Henderson gathering men, about the pattern of escalating harassment. Even Thomas Whitley, reluctantly, admitted to witnessing Henderson's threats in his store. The defense's case was weaker. Henderson claimed they'd only meant to scare the Crows into leaving, but when pressed about the blasting powder, his story fell apart. "Scare them with explosives?" Judge Thornton asked incredulously. "Mr. Henderson, in my experience, explosives are poor tools for gentle persuasion." Davis broke under questioning, admitting they'd planned to blow the door and shoot anyone who came out. Mason tried to claim he'd been drunk and didn't remember, but multiple witnesses placed him actively participating. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Margaret held Joseph's hand tightly as they waited, feeling the weight of more than just this trial. This was about whether the law would protect all citizens equally, whether their marriage would be recognized as worth defending. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Thornton asked when they returned. "We have, Your Honor." The foreman replied, "On the charge of attempted murder, we find all defendants guilty. On conspiracy to commit arson, guilty. On forming an illegal vigilante group, guilty." The courtroom erupted. Henderson supporters shouted protests while others applauded. Judge Thornton gavelled repeatedly for order. "Samuel Henderson," the judge pronounced when quiet returned, "you are sentenced to 15 years in the territorial prison. Your associates will serve 10 years each. And let me be clear, this court will not tolerate mob justice, not against anyone, regardless of their race or whom they choose to marry." As Henderson was led away in shackles, he twisted to glare at Margaret and Joseph. "This ain't over," he snarled. "You think you've won? There's more who think like me." "Mr. Henderson," Judge Thornton said coldly, "threats in my courtroom will add years to your sentence. I suggest you learn when to be quiet." Outside the courthouse, Margaret and Joseph stood in the Denver sunshine, still processing what had happened. Justice, real, legal justice, had been served. "It's not over," Joseph said quietly, echoing Henderson's threat. "There will be others." "Maybe," Margaret agreed. "But today, the law stood with us. That matters." Father Miguel approached, beaming. "You've set a precedent," he said. "This verdict will make others think twice before forming mobs." Sheriff Coleman joined them. "The judge wants to see you both in his chambers." They found Judge Thornton in his office. His judicial robes hung on a peg, looking more like a grandfather than the stern arbiter of justice. "Sit," he invited. "I wanted to speak privately. This trial was about more than just Henderson's crimes. It was about whether our laws protect all citizens equally. Your courage in pursuing justice rather than revenge has strengthened the rule of law in this territory." "We just wanted to be left in peace," Margaret said. "And you shall be." The judge assured them. "I'm appointing Sheriff Coleman as Special Territorial Marshal with jurisdiction over your area. Any further harassment will be met with federal response." He leaned forward. "But I also want to offer you something else. Mrs. Crow, your testimony showed remarkable intelligence and composure. Have you considered studying law?" Margaret blinked in surprise. "Women can't—" "Not practice in court, no, but they can clerk, research, draft documents. The law is changing, slowly. Someone like you could help it change faster." The idea was so unexpected, so full of possibility, that Margaret couldn't speak for a moment. Joseph's hand found hers. "Think about it." Judge Thornton said, "The offer stands." They left Denver 2 days later, after Margaret had visited a bookstore and purchased several legal texts. The journey home was quiet, both of them processing how much had changed. "You're thinking about the judge's offer," Joseph observed as they climbed into the mountains. "Is that foolish? A woman my age thinking of studying law?" "My mother used to say that wisdom comes from unexpected sources." Joseph replied, "Maybe justice does too." As their cabin came into view, repaired now, with new windows gleaming in the afternoon sun, Margaret felt a surge of emotion. They'd fought for this place, nearly died for it, and now the law itself had validated their right to it. "Home," she said softly. "Home," Joseph agreed, but he was looking at her when he said it. That night, as Margaret opened one of her new law books by lamplight, Joseph working on his carving beside her, she thought about the journey that had brought them here. From that snowy train platform where she'd claimed him with 3 words, through trials by fire and law, they'd built something stronger than either could have managed alone. "Joseph," she said suddenly, "we won." He looked up from his carving, a pair of birds, she noticed, perched together on a branch. "Yes," he said simply, "we won." But they both knew the victory was bigger than just the trial. They'd won the right to their chosen life, their unlikely love, their shared future. And that was worth every battle they'd fought to achieve it. Outside, snow began to fall again. But inside their cabin, warmth and purpose filled the space. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. It always did. But tonight, they were home. They were together. And they were free. The law had spoken, and for once, it had spoken for them. Spring came late to the mountains that year, but when it arrived, it transformed the world. Snow melted into rushing streams, wildflowers pushed through the damp earth, and the air filled with bird song. Margaret stood on the porch of their cabin, now expanded with a new room that would serve as her study, watching Joseph work in the garden they'd planned through the winter months. 5 years had passed since that day at the train station. 5 years since she'd spoken 3 words that changed everything. "Letter for you." Joseph called, returning from his trip to town. The journey that once filled them with dread had become routine. The verdict and Judge Thornton's protection had teeth, and while some still harbored prejudice, none dared act on it openly. Margaret took the envelope. Recognizing the Denver courthouse seal, her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. "Well?" Joseph asked, though his smile suggested he already knew. "I passed," she breathed. "The territorial bar examination. I can't practice in court, but I can serve as legal counsel, draft documents, advise clients." She looked up at him, eyes bright with tears. "Joseph, I'm one of the first women in the territory certified for legal work." He caught her up in his arms, spinning her around as she laughed. "My wife, the almost lawyer," he said proudly. Mother would have been so proud. They'd married properly the year after the trial, with Father Miguel officiating and Samuel Crow standing as witness. The ceremony had been small but significant. No longer just a mail-order arrangement, but a choice renewed with full knowledge of each other. "There's more," Margaret said when he set her down. "Judge Thornton wants me to help establish a legal aid office in Colchester for people who can't afford lawyers. Indians, Mexicans, poor whites, anyone who needs justice but can't pay for it." Joseph's face grew serious. "That's important work. Dangerous, maybe." "Maybe," she agreed, "but necessary. How many people like us never get justice because they can't afford it? Because they don't know their rights?" He studied her face, seeing there the same determination that had made her claim him at the station. "When would you start?" "Next month. I'd ride down twice a week, maintain an office there." She touched his face. "I know it means time apart." "It means you're becoming who you were meant to be." Joseph interrupted. "We'll manage the time. We've managed worse." That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson, Margaret reflected on the unexpected turns life could take. The plain spinster from Baltimore had become a frontier wife, then a student of law, and now something altogether new, a voice for those who had none. "I've been thinking," Joseph said suddenly, "about Henderson." Margaret tensed. Though imprisoned, Henderson remained a shadow from their past. "What about him?" Word is he's sick. Prison's been hard on him. His son wrote to me." "His son wrote to you?" Margaret was shocked. "Why?" Joseph pulled a crumpled letter from his pocket. "Says his father's changed. Wants to make amends before he dies. Asks if we'd consider visiting." Margaret's first instinct was refusal. Henderson had tried to kill them, had made their lives miserable out of pure hatred. But then she thought about justice versus vengeance, about the law books she'd been studying, about what it meant to truly win. "What do you think?" she asked. "I think," Joseph said slowly, "that hatred is a heavy thing to carry, for him and for us." 2 weeks later, they made the journey to the territorial prison. Henderson was indeed a changed man. Illness and confinement had hollowed him out, left him pale and shaking. But his eyes, when they saw Margaret and Joseph enter, held something that hadn't been there before: remorse. "Didn't think you'd come," he wheezed. "Neither did we," Margaret said honestly. Henderson struggled to sit up straighter. "I was wrong. About everything. You—" He looked at Joseph. "You're a better man than I ever was. And you," to Margaret, "you saw it when none of us could." He coughed, a harsh sound. "I wrote to my boy, told him the truth, that I was the criminal, not you, that what you have, it's real, more real than the hate I carried." Joseph stood silent for a long moment. Then he extended his hand. Henderson took it with both of his, tears streaming down his weathered face. "I forgive you," Joseph said simply. As they left the prison, Margaret felt something lift from her shoulders. The past wasn't erased, but it no longer held them captive. "You're a good man, Joseph Crow," she said as they drove away. "I learned from a good woman," he replied. The following month, Margaret opened her legal aid office in a small building on Colchester's main street. The sign read simply, "M. Crow, Legal Advisor, Justice for All." Her first client was a Mexican farmer being cheated by a land speculator. Her second, an Apache woman whose children had been taken without cause. Word spread quickly that Mrs. Crow would help anyone, regardless of ability to pay. Joseph supported her work in his quiet way, sometimes accompanying her to town, his presence a reminder that she wasn't alone. The sight of them together, the giant Apache man and the plain white woman, no longer drew stares of shock, but nods of recognition. They'd become part of the landscape, as natural as the mountains themselves. One evening, as Margaret worked late preparing a case, Joseph entered her study with a cup of tea and something wrapped in cloth. "What's this?" she asked. "Open it." Inside was a carved wooden sign, beautifully detailed, 2 birds on a branch, facing each other, with the words, "Crow and Crow, partners in law and life," beneath. "For your office," he said, "if you like it." Margaret traced the carving with her fingers, remembering that first winter when he'd carved birds by firelight. "It's perfect," she whispered. As spring turned to summer, their life found its rhythm. Margaret's practice grew, bringing justice to those who'd never expected it. Joseph's horse training business flourished, his reputation for honest dealing drawing clients from 3 territories. Their home became a haven not just for them but for others. Samuel often visited with news from the reservation. Father Miguel came for dinner. Even Sheriff Coleman stopped by to discuss cases with Margaret. One night, as they lay in bed listening to coyotes sing in the distance, Joseph spoke into the darkness. "Do you ever regret it, choosing me that day?" Margaret turned to face him, seeing his profile in the moonlight. "Do you know what I thought when I saw you standing there on that platform?" "What?" "I thought, there's a man who knows how to endure, who stands tall when the world tries to make him small, who has dignity in the face of cruelty." She touched his face. "I didn't choose you out of desperation, Joseph. I chose you because I recognized something in you that matched something in me. We're both fighters, both survivors. Together, we're more than either could be alone." "Margaret." "And," she continued, "you're mine, then, now, always. Let anyone try to tell me otherwise. He pulled her close, and she felt him smile against her hair. Still stubborn. Still yours, she corrected. As dawn broke over their mountains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Margaret thought about the journey that had brought them here. From rejection and loneliness to partnership and purpose. From a desperate gamble at a train station to a life built on mutual respect and deepening love. The world hadn't become perfect. Prejudice still existed. Challenges still arose. But they'd carved out a space where justice could grow. Where love could flourish despite the odds. Where two people who didn't fit anywhere else fit perfectly with each other. "Joseph," she said as morning light filled their room. "We're going to make a difference. With the legal practice, with your work, with just being who we are. We're going to change things." "We already have," he said softly. "We already have." And as the mountains woke around them, as their life together stretched ahead full of possibility and purpose, Margaret knew he was right. They'd already changed things, starting with themselves, rippling outward like circles in a pond, two winter people who'd found spring in each other, proving that sometimes the most unlikely love stories are the ones that endure. In the distance, a train whistle echoed off the mountains, new arrivals coming west, new stories beginning, and somewhere among them, perhaps another soul who needed to hear what Margaret had learned. That love isn't about fitting expectations, but about choosing courage. That strength comes in many forms, and that sometimes 3 simple words can change everything. "You're mine now," she whispered one more time, the words that had started it all. "And you're mine," Joseph replied, the promise that would sustain them through whatever came next. Outside, the world turned on, full of challenge and change. But inside their mountain home, built by hand and heart, 2 people faced the future together, partners in law and life. Proof that love could grow in the most unlikely ground, strong as the mountains that sheltered them.